Welcome to the Human Current,
where we have casual conversations about complexity
in work, life, and all the things we do.
It's time to get curious.
And curiouser. We're here at the 9th International Conference on Complex Systems, and we had a second to sit down with Gad Saad. Very excited about this. Gad is an evolutionary behavioral scientist who's known for applying evolutionary psychology to marketing and consumer behavior. He's also a professor of marketing at Concordia University and a public intellect. We find him online as the Gadfather. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Would you just start off by telling us a little more about yourself and the work that you do in case our listeners are unfamiliar?
Sure. So I basically apply evolutionary theory to understand the human mind, and then I look for places to apply that. So it could be, given that I'm housed in a business school, one of the things that interests me is our consumatory nature. Mm-hmm. So what are some of our biological vestiges that manifest themselves in a modern environment? And so I look at things like how do hormones affect women's behaviors, gift-giving practices, and how these might be related to gift-giving and other species. And so I look at all of the ways by which our consuming instinct manifests itself.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. As a marketing major, I love your work.
Oh, great.
I'm a marketing background, but I love the psychology side of it. I find it fascinating and just happened to fall into the complexity realm through a mentor who funds the podcast. So it's interesting to see you here at this conference. Can you tell us how you ended up here?
Right. So I was contacted by Joe Norman, the gentleman who's organizing the workshop, who I guess follows my work. Mm-hmm. I'll be talking about this notion of consilience. Consilience is a term that was reintroduced into the lexicon by E.O. Wilson, the Harvard biologist. Consilience refers to unity of knowledge. So some fields are inherently more organized than others. Physics is more organized than sociology. Chemistry is more organized than marketing. Mm-hmm. Not because physicists are smarter than sociologists, but because physicists work within certain organized frameworks. And so what I'll be talking about at today's session is how do you build an argument to prove that something is an adaptation. So if you want to say, for example, that risk-taking is a sexually selected trait, how would you demonstrate that? If you want to prove that the hourglass figure that men so desire in women around the world is an adaptation, how would you go about proving that? And you do so by looking for evidence across many, many different disciplines, across many different time periods, across many different cultures. So you slowly build enough evidence that it becomes unassailable that the argument that you're making is veridical. And so that's what I'll be talking about.
Wow, fascinating. So you're going to be talking in a group with Nassim, and I see some parallels in what you guys talk about. And so can you kind of describe how your work aligns with his? He talks about skin in the game and,
right.
and risk-taking.
Sure. So there's a phenomenon in biology called costly signaling. So for example, if you take the peacock's tail could not have evolved due to survival, because if anything, having a big tail reduces your survivability. Instead, it arises because of female mate choice. It's an honest signal of the male's genotypic quality. It's basically saying, look, despite the fact that I'm carrying this burdensome tail, this tail that makes it more difficult for me to avoid predators, I'm here and I've survived. Choose me. It's an honest signal. So for a signal to be honest, it has to be costly. And one of the things that I think we admire in one another, Nassim and I, is that we are both irreverent to orthodoxy. We speak our minds, something that regrettably is very, very rare in academia.
Yep.
You would think that in academia, people would be at the forefront of making bold statements. Most are regrettably suffer from herd mentality. So I think more than anything, what unites us is our desire to promote people who have skin in the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's interesting how you're in academia and you go online to be a public figurehead and talk about these intellectual topics. So it takes a lot of courage. And I'm wondering if maybe you went to the public because you weren't able to discuss these in academia, or you felt like you needed to take another route.
You know, as soon as I discovered all of the benefits that are yielded via all of these social media tools. Look, as an academic, I'm in the business of creating knowledge and then disseminating knowledge. Now, there are many ways by which I could disseminate the knowledge. I could teach in a classroom. I could publish in peer-reviewed journals, which is typically only going to be read by other academics. And I could go out. I mean, I could appear on the Joe Rogan show, and by the end of that show, 10 million people might become excited about evolutionary psychology. I think the problem with many academics, again, not to bash my colleagues, but many of them suffer from sort of an ivory tower complex, right? If I'm a serious academic, I should not be speaking to Joe Rogan. That's beneath me. Baloney. Joe Rogan has more influence than CNN, CBS, and CBC, all the different stations you can think of. And so it's all about reach. And so for me, it's a very pragmatic reason that I decided to be in the public. I'm interested in discussing ideas, and I will use any and all possible ways to achieve that goal.
And we were talking about the podcast platform and how you can have these really long, nuanced conversations that you don't see in the regular media platforms. And why do you think that's so important to have these deeper conversations where you can touch on many different areas?
I think because it really does create this incredible sense of intimacy. When people are afforded the opportunity to sort of be flies on the wall, listening to two people really dig into each other's ideas for an hour, 2 hours. Now, usually on my show, I don't spend as much as, say, Joe Rogan does about 3-hour shows. My shows are about maybe an hour to 75 minutes, but that's still enough time for people to really dig into some solid ideas. You give the person an opportunity to expand on whatever they're thinking. Whereas when you appear in the typical sort of mainstream media, you have 2, 3, 5 minutes. So you have a very little snippet to make a point. It's artificial, it's fake. It doesn't allow you to expand. And so I think most people really appreciate that. And if I look at all my shows on my channel, almost all of the ones that have been the most viewed are the long format conversations. You would think that the 3-minute snippets would be the ones that would go viral. No, it's the 1 hour, 2 hour chats that become the most popular ones.
Yeah, we were playing with the length of our episodes for a while. And, Complexity podcast, it's really hard to talk about complexity in a 20-minute spot.
Right.
But you want to be conscious of people's time and, feel out how the conversation is going to go. But I think that 45-minute, 1 hour window is a good length of time to really dig in with somebody.
Yeah.
It's what we've learned anyway after a couple years of doing this.
How many have you done so far?
We've done, I think this is 95.
Okay.
Yeah.
So very nice.
Yeah.
Congrats. Almost at 100.
Yeah, we're getting there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about your book and dig in a little deeper to the topics that you touch on: evolutionary consumption, evolutionary psychology. So why is that so important to talk about?
So if you want to be a good marketer, you're basically someone who understands human nature. You can't be a good marketer and go against human nature. You could have a $6 billion advertising budget, but you're not going to convince people to eat or drink grass juice because that's not something that is consistent with our evolved gustatory preferences. And I'll just give you one or two other examples. There was a company a few years ago, can't remember the exact name of the company. They wanted to create a new line of romance novels where the male archetype would be more gentle, more sensitive, and so on. Guess what happened to that line?
Didn't do so well?
Didn't do so well. Because across the world, when women read romance novels, it's the exact same male archetype. He's tall, he's a prince, and he's a neurosurgeon. He wrestles alligators on his six-pack. He's reckless except for this woman who could tame his wild side. It's the exact same male archetype because that's the fantasy that particular product is appealing to. So from a practical perspective, if you want to understand marketing, you have to understand human nature. Well, what's human nature? It is driven by a shared biological heritage. And scientifically speaking, the reason I'm interested in this problem of applying biology to study behavior is that it might surprise you that most social scientists remain very reticent of the idea that humans in general and consumers in particular are shaped by biology. They usually argue that what makes us human is that we transcend our biology. Biology is relevant for the mosquito, for your dog, for the zebra, but not consumers. Consumers are above biology. Well, that's ridiculous. That's idiotic. And so both scientifically and from a practical perspective, trying to understand the fundamental biological drivers of consumer behavior is a beautiful thing to study.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because it's like this feedback loop that If you are being told that that's the kind of material that you are into, or when you're a child, for instance, on the Disney Channel,
Right.
and you have the princess and then the knight that comes to rescue the princess, and this story that's kind of played over and over again for little girls. And then we continue down that path into adulthood looking for that hero or that kind of archetype. So is it a cycle that is all biology, or is it a mixture of what we're also being told?
So nurture exists in its form because of nature. So the idea that there's a dichotomy between nature and nurture is a false dichotomy, right? So evolutionary psychologists such as myself don't argue that socialization is not important. Socialization is important, but socialization exists in its form across endless cultures precisely because of biology. There is no religion that's ever been devised, unless you think it is divine, where it is men who are told to be chaste, right? And every single religion where there is a statement about sexuality, it is usually very concerned with female chastity. Now, there are very clear biological reasons why men would be terrified of female sexuality, and therefore they try to tame it. So, yes, women are socialized, for example, through religion to be sexually chaste, but there are biological reasons for that. So everything, whether it be nurture or nature, is due to biology.
This has got my wheels spinning now. So the patterns, obviously, they overlap. It's not one or the other.
Right.
Our role in marketing is really, really important. And we can be manipulative with biology when we also have the knowledge of it. How do we go forward with that ethical lens?
Look, for example, we all have a desire for fatty foods, high caloric foods, because we've evolved in an environment of caloric scarcity and caloric uncertainty. So the fact that McDonald's and Burger King tells us, hey, come to our store and buy our fatty French fries is not really unethical. They're really catering to an evolved penchant. The only thing that they're doing is that the next time that your blood sugar level is down, please have us be top of mind. Don't go to McDonald's, come to Burger King. It's very rare that marketers will come up with a product that is so manipulative that is outside of our biological norms of reactions. You see what I mean?
Yep.
And we also have the evolved ability for moral restraint, right? For example, when I explain to people that, look, we've evolved a desire to both be pair bonded, to be in monogamous unions, but we're also evolved to stray. And so then people get very upset. They say, oh, you're offering a scientific justification for cheating, which of course I'm not, because we've also evolved the moral compass to allow us to not stray. So there are these multiple Darwinian pulls that are pulling us in different directions, and each person will decide what's the right trade-off for him or her.
So it sounds like it's really more important for individuals to have that sort of awareness.
Right.
So that they can navigate the world in an empowered, informed way, because it's not necessarily, marketers are just, their job is to sell and
to provide information, and then it's up to you to act on it or not.
Yep.
I'll give you an example of your empowerment point. So I did a study with one of my former graduate students where we looked at the effects of the menstrual cycle on women's behaviors. One of the things that we looked at is food-related behaviors across the menstrual cycle. So imagine that a woman is now trying to go on a diet. Now, she probably already knows what we found just by virtue of having lived as a woman. There are certain times in your menstrual cycle where you're likely to be more attracted to high-calorie foods or less so. Now, having that knowledge scientifically validated can ultimately help you be aware of the pitfalls of where it might be more or less difficult for you to keep track with your diet. So ultimately, as a professor of behavioral science, if you like, I don't care about how my work is ultimately applied or misapplied. All I try to do is understand the human condition. How people ultimately apply it is up to them.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. I think it's interesting, the studies that you do. I'm wondering if there's like other elements that you stack on top of, like you said, with the menstrual cycles, and how certain foods have certain behavioral traits because of that. In that study, is there other layers that came out of that, or other ahas that were connected to that cycle?
So we looked at two sets of behaviors. One is related to survival, one is related to mating. So the survival part was the food-related behavior. We also looked at mating-related behavior, specifically beautification practices. So when are women most likely to engage in beautification? Wear sexy clothes, be scantily clad, wear more makeup, wear stilettos. And not surprisingly, that's most likely to happen during the maximally fertile phase of their cycles, during the ovulatory phase. Now, oftentimes people will say, oh, but what do you mean? You think people are sitting there and checking their menstrual cycles? Of course not, right? The proximate mechanisms are automatic, right? I feel more sexy energy when I'm in the maximum. I feel less bloated. I feel more sexually desired, or I'd like to be more desired. For something to be an adaptive mechanism, it doesn't have to be conscious, right? Breathing is an adaptation, yet I don't know the exact genes by which breathing is coded, but I know it's an adaptation. So there's a slew of detractors of evolutionary psychology that really, frankly, piss me off, because they consistently ape the same gargantuan stupidity, and in doing so, they only ever demonstrate that they know nothing about evolutionary psychology. If you'd like, I can talk about some of those detractors.
Yeah, well, why not?
Sure, okay. So most of the detractors are usually very ideologically driven. If I'm a radical feminist, I hate evolutionary psychology because, what do you mean? You're saying that there are innate sex differences? That's heretical. If I am a postmodernist, what do you mean? You're saying that there are universal truths, but as a postmodernist, there are no universal truths. How could there be biological truths? If I am a religious person, so if all this is explained through evolution, where does God fit in? So all sorts of people hate evolutionary psychology, not for scientific reasons, but because it attacks their ideological edifice. The few, quote, scientific criticisms of evolutionary psychology are just as idiotic. So, for example, one argument is, well, evolutionary psychologists sort of sit around smoking a pipe and constructing post hoc stories, right? They come up with post hoc stories about why this happened, that. Nothing could be further from the truth. As a matter of fact, today's session, I'll be explaining the mechanism by which you build evidence for an adaptation. And this is something called nomological networks of cumulative evidence. You very, very slowly build an extraordinary amount of evidence that perfectly demonstrates that this is an adaptation. That's exactly what Charles Darwin had done in 1859 in his book, Origin of Species. He collected data from several decades from many, many different sources to prove that natural selection was the means by which species evolve. And so those who argue that, oh, we just sit around making up stories are only demonstrating that they are perfectly idiotic about what evolutionary psychologists do.
Do you think of that as just mostly based off of a lack of education? Because like with your presentation, it's not just your voice, right? It's not just storytelling, but you have more to go off of, more to talk about in the research itself.
There's several reasons why these guys keep aping those criticisms. I think evolutionary psychology really shakes the foundation of people. People don't like to hear that their personhood is ultimately a product of this cold mechanism of evolution, right? If you explain to me why love has evolved, somehow it's no longer as magical. But that's not true.
I feel like it's more magical.
There you go.
Yeah.
So there are all sorts of reasons why people are jarred by evolutionary psychology. But really, I don't have an ulterior motive by being an evolutionary psychologist. I simply want to better understand human nature. I'll give you maybe one or two other quick examples. Oftentimes people think that if you explain a phenomenon using evolutionary theory, you're justifying the phenomenon, right? So if you explain why child abuse happens from an evolutionary perspective. So let me ask you if you can guess this. Do you know what is the number one best predictor of there being child abuse in a home?
I do, actually.
What is it?
There's a step parent in the
Look at
family.
you.
Yeah.
Look
woo.
at you. It's actually 100-fold.
Yeah, it's huge, huge. Yeah.
So, I mean, usually in medicine, for example, or in any science, an odds ratio, if something has a 20% chance more likelihood, wow, that's a powerful effect. This is 100-fold more. Now, the reason for that is very simple. We are a heavily invested parental species, and therefore most people don't really appreciate investing in children of others. And therefore, to the extent that you're going to have child abuse, it's going to come from a non-biological parent.
Right.
Now, when you explain that, you're not saying that it's okay to abuse children.
Right.
You're saying that if you truly want to understand this dreadful reality, identify the proper causes. If you want to understand rape, there are evolutionary reasons for rape. That doesn't mean that you're saying rape is okay. Mm-hmm. To the contrary, you're saying if you want to understand the dreadful, horrific crime of rape, look for the real causes. If you want to understand why people cheat on their partners, you're not justifying it. And usually the retort that I give people, this is like arguing that if you're an oncologist who studies cancer, you are for cancer. You are justifying cancer. So that's the type of nonsense that I consistently have to fight. And to go back to your earlier question, why do I go to the public? Because that gives me a much bigger platform to fight the tsunami of idiocy.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I feel like people don't like to realize that we're mammals.
We're animals.
Yeah, I mean, we're not above it. We're a part of it. You know, that eco versus ego. And I don't think people like to hear that we really do have these innate traits in our biology. because then we have to realize that kind of shifts our entire paradigm. We're not above the planet and the animals and the other ecosystems that we coexist within.
And to that point, I think that when you come from an evolutionary perspective, you realize, if you want to get green, that we really are part of one big tree of life, right? The dog is my evolutionary cousin. I mean, as someone who loves dogs, once in a while I see some animal behaviors come out with a study saying, discovery, dogs have feelings. and then I think, have you ever interacted with a dog?
Yeah.
Have you ever seen a dog? And so, of course, there are cousins. And so, to use Peter Singer's argument, to increase the moral circle, once you're an evolutionist, you realize that all living forms are intricately linked. And so, it's a beautiful message.
Yeah. And I know you sometimes are on the internet portrayed as anti-religion. I have a perspective that they could coexist. And I do think that there could be a God that allowed the evolutionary process to take place and that God himself would evolve, because why would you create a system that was stagnant? It doesn't really make sense. So I think holding space for paradigms like that, which is a huge paradigm shift, allows you to really open up to other perspectives, other ideas, and explore those with a truly open mind. Not to say that you have to believe one way or the other, but to kind of live in that land of paradox and embrace it and realize we all don't know. We don't know what's going on here. We're just a part of it.
To add to what you just said, I had on my show Jerry Coyne, who's an evolutionary biologist at University of Chicago, and he wrote a book, I hope I don't botch it, I think it's called Faith versus Fact, where he was specifically looking at this idea of whether science and religion can coexist. And so the position that you took is what Stephen Jay Gould, the late Harvard paleontologist, referred to as the NOMA principle, non-overlapping magisterium. So he's what's called an accommodationist. He's trying to accommodate both the religious and the scientific. He's basically saying, hey, look, both deal with separate spheres, and why can't they coexist? Some more ardent scientists don't buy into this accommodationist things, precisely because they argue, and I think I'm in that group. I'm saying that very gently, given what you said. There is nothing that religion offers that is outside the purview of science. So, for example, morality is typically the realm where religious folks say, but how do you explain our moral sense? Well, there's only about 13 trillion studies that have been conducted looking at the evolution of morality. But then again, I appreciate that religion is probably never going to go away, because ultimately we are, I think, the only animal that is endowed with the recognition that we are here in a finite party and eventually we're going to die.
Right, yeah.
And, right, if I have high cholesterol, I go see my physician, he gives me Lipitor, and boom, my cholesterol is good. But there's this one problem that I can't solve, and that's called my mortality. And to the extent that religion, quote, solves that problem for me, religion will always be with us.
Yeah, and I think that there's elements of it that are really great and powerful traditions.
Sure.
The culture and history within it kind of tells us the story of our humanity in a lot of ways, and that's also really powerful. I feel like people are born with a human spirit. Everyone has a human spirit. Everyone is born with a moral compass, and there's not any sort of hierarchy in that. And that's where it becomes really dangerous when you tell me I have to go through somebody else or go through an establishment to get to God. I don't buy that.
So you think it's a personal relationship?
Yes.
Okay.
But it's interesting that the scientific world, we're exploring why we're here, what's happening. And I think that spirituality is a huge component of that. But if they were put together, then there could be some extra elements as far as how we figure that stuff out.
So there is a foundation called the Templeton Foundation, which seeks to exactly fund research regarding what you just said. They try to, if you'd like, fund scientists who ultimately are going to find common grounds between religion and science. Now, again, if you're an accommodationist, you love that foundation. If you're a hardcore scientist who believes that religion has no place at the table, then you're not happy with that foundation. So it depends which outlook you have.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious to see where that goes in the coming years, because we've also spoke with an institute in California, the IONS Institute, and they study human consciousness. So they were founded by an astronaut, Edgar Mitchell. So he goes into space and he has this like out-of-body experience looking down on the Earth, and he's like, we're all interconnected.
Right.
It was like this overpowering feeling of love and interconnection. And so he came back down to Earth and he's like, we need to study that. We need to know what that is, that consciousness piece, and started the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And it's really amazing research. They back everything with hard science. They do experiments.
That are published in real journals. Okay, good.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating.
Nice.
Yeah, so I'm curious to see where that goes, and I know that evolutionary psychology is a piece of that. And I think everyone's story is important, so, let's just holding space for that. So I don't want to take up too much of your time. Such a privilege to sit down with you.
Thank you for having me.
We had this really funny interaction when we first met you, and Stephen Wolfram was in our booth.
That's right.
That was cool to be a fly on the wall for that interaction.
Yeah, we've since connected via email.
You have.
We've gone back and forth. So let's see if we can keep that conversation going. He seems like a very interesting guy.
Yeah, he's a whole other level, computing genius. So holding a conversation with him for 45 minutes was interesting.
Yeah, I think you had him on the show the day that we met, right?
Yeah, that night. That was a lot of fun. He did a lot of storytelling and stuff. So yeah, I'm so glad you're here at this conference and our paths met and that you're giving a talk here. Is there anything that you'd like to share with our listeners before we let you go? Anything in the works for you or coming up?
My next book I'm working on is a book looking at... So let me just step back a sec. So there are these biological pathogens, these brain parasites that will parasitize an organism, rendering it maladaptive. So for example, there's a parasite that when it goes inside a mouse, the mouse loses its innate fear of cats, which is not a good thing. Or there's another kind of brain parasite that when it goes into ungulates, elk, moose, deer, they will start engaging in circling behavior. They just start going in a circle. And even if the predators are coming, they can't extricate themselves from that circle. So I take this idea of brain parasites and I then apply it to what I call idea pathogens, idea parasites.
Oh.
So in the same way that actual physical worms can parasitize your brain, I argue that bad ideas can parasitize your brain, rendering you maladaptive. And these idea pathogens, I argue, have evolved regrettably in the ecosystem called the university that has spread these dreadful ideas: postmodernism, radical feminism, identity politics, political correctness, cultural relativism. So you put this melange of bullshit and you end up with really maladaptive thinking. And so what I do is I trace the origins of these idea pathogens through the university, some of the negative consequences as a result of these bad parasites, and then how do we inoculate ourselves against these bad ideas? How do you actually develop good thinking hygiene? And so that's my next book, currently writing it. Be on the lookout for it.
Very cool. Yeah, definitely. We'd love to have you back on the show after your book goes out.
Would be happy to.
Thank you so much for joining us, Gad, the Gadfather. Thank you.
Cheers.
Oh, wait, be sure to join the conversation.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. Send your soundbite to hello@human-current.com. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter @Let's Work Happy.
Visit our website, human-current.com, to subscribe to our blog or inquire about being a guest on our show. You can also find us on Facebook and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank Broke for Free for providing some awesome music for our show. Check out more of his music at brokeforfree.com. This episode was co-edited by Noah Stiles and the Human Current.